Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Father Matthew Carnes, and I have the privilege of serving as the director of the Center for Latin American Studies here at Georgetown University. We're delighted to have you joining us for this online event, Creating Conditions for Social Justice in Central America. Now, Georgetown, with its 200-year legacy of academic excellence, our Washington, D.C. location, our Jesuit values, and our regional networks, we see ourselves and are proud to be as one of the leading U.S. universities engaged in Latin America. Faculty and students across our research and teaching programs address critical challenges facing the Americas, including economic growth and innovation, governance and the rule of law, social and cultural cohesion, and environmental sustainability. And we're especially proud to have recently founded the Georgetown Americas Institute, which harnesses the many strengths of the university to pursue ever greater relationships with and impact in the hemisphere. Today's event is the second event in the Central America in Focus series, and it brings together stakeholders across sectors to address the policy, financial, and civil society dimensions of the challenges facing the region. This afternoon, as I said, our topic is creating conditions for social justice in Central America. Now, in recent years, nations throughout the Americas have sought to build their democracies on the foundations of inclusion, of justice, of human rights. The term social justice has been a touchstone in many countries, emphasizing a distribution of wealth, of opportunities, of rights, in a way consistent with the equal dignity of each human being. In Central America, this has taken a particular shape. The pursuit of social justice has required addressing long-standing inequalities, legacies of violence that have marred the region, political, economic, and social divides have loomed large, and at times they've seemed too massive and too deep-rooted to overcome. Nevertheless, we see significant progress towards democracy, towards economic growth, towards new opportunities in the region, and a wide variety of governmental, non-governmental, and especially civil society organizations have taken a lead role in trying to foster new foundations for social and political life in Central America. So today we'll examine both the challenges and the opportunities that this presents, and most importantly, the exciting new initiatives that have emerged from social actors promoting justice. We're fortunate to be joined by an outstanding group of panelists. Let me briefly introduce each of them. First, Celina de Sola is co-founder of and president of programs at Glasswing. Her work focuses on designing and implementing innovative, community-based initiatives that bring together institutions and people for joint action. She's worked as a consultant for organizations like the Population Council, URC, and family foundations. She was a crisis interventionist for Latino immigrants in the US, and subsequently spent over 5 years as director of emergency response for AmeriCares. She's a fellow of the Obama Foundation, Ashoka, Lego Reimagine Learning, Penn Social Impact House, and many other organizations. She serves on several nonprofit boards, is a member of the Inter-American Foundation's Advisory Council. She's also been featured on Time, CNN en Español, HuffPost Live, Forbes Central America, and many other venues. She holds a master's degree in public health from Harvard University and one in social work from the University of Pennsylvania School of Social Policy and Practice. Celina, we're delighted to have you here with us. Next, Ivan Taylor is an Emmy-winning journalist and investigative reporter at Univision. He has 18 years of experience in the industry of broadcasting. Prior to Univision Miami, Ivan Taylor was based out of New York, where he worked for Telemundo 47 as weekend news anchor. Soon after, he joined Telemundo Network News as national correspondent and relocated to Houston, Texas, covering news from the Lone Star State and the surrounding areas. Throughout his career, he's reported on presidential elections in Latin America, specifically in Venezuela and Nicaragua. He recently traveled to Havana to cover developments in diplomatic relations between the United States and Cuba. He also covered the historic visit of Pope Francis to the island as one of the few journalists allowed to enter Cuba with a journalistic visa. He received a bachelor's degree in mass communications and journalism from Florida International University and earned an Associate of Arts degree from Miami-Dade College. Then welcome to you as well, Ivan. And finally, Michael Camilleri serves as Senior Advisor to the Administrator and Executive Director of USAID's Northern Triangle Task Force. He was most recently director of the Peter D. Bell Rule of Law program at the Inter-American Dialogue. From 2012 to 2017, he served in the Obama and Biden administration as the Western Hemisphere advisor on the Secretary of State's policy planning staff and as director for Andean Affairs in the National Security Council. Earlier in his career, he worked as a human rights lawyer at the Organization of American States, the Center for Justice and International Law, and with the Coalition of Civil Society Organizations in Guatemala. He's a former team member on the Council on Foreign Relations, and his analysis has appeared in Foreign Affairs and Foreign Policy, the New York Times, and the Washington Post. A Maltese immigrant raised in Minnesota, Michael holds a BA in history from the University of Notre Dame and a JD from Harvard Law School. It's wonderful to have you here with us as well, Michael. So now let's turn to our panelists. And I want to open up our conversation a little bit, reflecting on where the region, Central America, stands right now. There have been periods in the region's history where it seemed to have particular sets of challenges that stretched across countries. At one time, that was authoritarian governments and military rules, human rights abuses. It was then in another period, economic restructuring and establishing the roots of democracy. In the early 2000s, it seemed like democracy was on the rise. We saw more and more participation, more and more awareness of social issues around questions like gender and indigeneity. These seem to reach more and more awareness and more participation. In some sense, we could think of each of these periods as slightly different. So if you were going to characterize the period we see today in Central America, reflecting on where we stand at this present moment, reflecting or remembering the great diversity of experiences across the countries that make up Central America. But where would you say we stand? What are the distinct problems, the distinct opportunities? How do you assess this from your vantage points? And so we'll start with the US government, with USAID and Michael's perspective. Then we'll think maybe pass next to Selena and her perspective, working with Glasswing and working with civil society organizations. And then finally to Ivan from his perspective as a journalist and someone who understands the human rights and law implications of this so very well. So let me turn the mic first over to Michael. So welcome again. And how do you assess this present moment?
Thank you so much, Father Carnes. It's really a pleasure to be with you, with Selena and Ivan. Want to congratulate you on the creation of the Georgetown Americas Institute. It's a very exciting development for all of us Latin America watchers in Washington, and really pleased to be able to participate in this series focused on Central America. I'm sure we will learn a lot that can benefit our work from this conversation and the ones to come. I had a pleasure of meeting Selena in June in El Salvador. We were there with the administrator on her very first trip abroad as head of USAID, and I just want to commend in particular the work that Glasswing does, much of it in collaboration with USAID, and look forward to hearing from her the latest on state of affairs in El Salvador. We have to respond to your question, Father. The Biden administration sees enormous challenges and significant opportunities as well in the Northern Triangle. And I think those are reflected in the root causes strategy that you will be familiar with, that was released in July, that really captures kind of the new strategic framework that this administration brings to the region. That strategy, in short, is focused on promoting inclusive economic growth, on improving democratic governance, on protecting human rights, on protecting citizen security, and combating gender-based violence. And I'll have more to say, I'm sure, as we go through the conversation about that strategy. But I think what I'd like to do is maybe just take as a cue to respond to your question, the framing of this discussion on social justice. And immediately when I received the invitation to participate, my mind wandered back to a conversation we had on that same trip in June. After visiting El Salvador on the last leg of the trip, we were in Guatemala and Huehuetenango. And we had, with Administrator Power, the chance to have a conversation with Cardinal Ramazzini, who's the Bishop of Huehuetenango, well known, I'm sure, to many people tuning in to this conversation as a champion of social justice and indigenous rights in his home country. Now, just for a bit of context, Huehuetenango is up in the Western Highlands of Guatemala. It's an area plagued by poverty and food insecurity. It has one of the highest rates of both infant mortality and maternal mortality, not just in Central America, but in Latin America. The stunting rate among the indigenous population is a stunning 70%. Guatemala, of course, is an upper middle income country, not by much, but an upper middle income country, a very unequal one. And that inequality is really vivid in a place like Huehuetenango. And now, not coincidentally, this is also an area of an epicenter of irregular migration out of Guatemala. So when we had this conversation, we visited the area with Administrator Power. We saw some of the amazing work that USAID is doing with partners in the region, addressing challenges like food insecurity and maternal mortality. We're partnering, for example, with a university in Huehuetenango to train indigenous women to be midwives. We've partnered with a local agribusiness to build and equip a modern agricultural center that's going to train 36,000 small farmers to receive training to improve their crop production, increase their yields, give them stronger access to markets. And so, having sort of seen the breadth and depth of the challenges in the region, as well as some of the solutions that we're trying to bring to bear, we had this conversation with the Cardinal, and the administrator asked him, what is the single thing your people need? And he mentioned, some the poverty, the food insecurity, the family separation, many of these very kind of apparent challenges that folks in the region are facing. But he sort of centered on this one thing. He said, what we need is profound structural change. And I think that response, which really stayed with me, it certainly stayed with the administrator. I'm hoping to see the Cardinal again in a couple of weeks when I travel to the region. I think the response speaks profoundly to the challenges confronting Northern Central America and those of us in many walks of life, including in the U.S. government, who are thinking about how we provide or how we help Guatemalans, Salvadorans, and Hondurans build lives of dignity and opportunity in their home countries. It is why the Biden-Harris administration is making a historic investment in the region under the root causes strategy that I mentioned. But it's also why we're realistic about the fact that our foreign assistance can be catalytic. It can galvanize political will in some cases, but it's not a panacea, and it's not going to replace the responsibilities that Central American governments have to their own people. And so that is why I think when you look at the strategy and you look at what the administration has done so far in terms of its diplomatic approach and its development approach, there is such a strong emphasis on issues of democratic governance, human rights, and perhaps in particular combating corruption. I would just pause on that as I conclude. Corruption, as we know, it corrodes public services, it increases inequality, it drives away foreign investment, it undercuts the social compact and citizens' faith and trust in their own governments. It also, again, not coincidentally, drives outward migration in ways that are both direct and indirect. In Honduras, for example, an estimated 12.5% of GDP is lost to corruption. In a single year, 2019, 28% of citizens paid a bribe to access a government service, something they have a right to. And in that same country, in Honduras, USAID research indicates that victims of corruption are 47% more likely to migrate. So we have a very direct stake in this issue. And while you won't see in the root causes strategy, perhaps, the language of social justice per se, I think what you will see is a framework for regional engagement that's very much focused on addressing not just the symptoms, the poverty, the violence, the food insecurity, all of these critical issues that drive irregular migration, but also the underlying political decisions, and in many cases, the governance failures that stand in the way of the profound structural change that Cardinal Ramazzini spoke about. So maybe with that, Father, I'll turn it back to you and look forward to hearing what our other panelists have to say on this issue.
Thank you for those comments, I think which situate us so very well on this topic of a needed profound structural change and this idea of social justice, which really does invite us to think about a refoundation of society in some ways, a restructuring of society around basic questions of dignity, of participation, of anti-corruption, of clarity of the rule of law, that then would give people the expectations that will allow them to participate fully in society and not feel like they need to out-migrate. So I think that you've set that up extremely well, and that vignette from Wewe Tanango is something that will stay with me. Let me turn next to Selena, as I mentioned. So Selena, you partner some with USAID. You have extensive experience on the ground working with grassroots organizations. How do you see this from the ground up, in the building of these structures? How would you assess the region at this moment?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what Michael was saying. I want to say thank you also for having me here today, Father Carnes and the whole team. We're really excited to continue to be involved with the work you're doing in the region. I think, I agree with the structural challenges. I think it's absolutely necessary to address both the structural and systemic challenges in our countries. And as I'm from El Salvador, and as a Salvadoran who also, I'm one of the co-founders of Glasswing. We started a Salvadoran organization that now works regionally, and we actually do work a lot with USAID. I can say that undoubtedly the role of civil society is becoming even more important in addressing social justice. And I think sometimes just social justice in its purest sense isn't discussed, right? A lot of times we talk about social justice in different contexts, but when you talk to people in communities, they won't necessarily talk about social justice. It's almost like you've been so deprived of it that it's not even part of your, everyday language. And I think one of the things I want to emphasize is that working at a community level, we work a lot with young people. That's our focus. Again, like when we talk to young people, they don't say there's a lack of social justice, but they do say how that becomes evident, right? How it becomes evident in the fact that they're exposed to chronic and acute violence, extreme violence regularly, that's so much so that it's normalized, right? If someone disappeared, we've had several young people disappear even in recent weeks. That just is something that happens all the time, right? So that obviously links to impunity and so many of the challenges that we see around violence and the consequences of it. And the other thing that we see a lot of is that's linked to violence is just that exposure to violence can lead to trauma, and that chronic exposure to violence can lead to trauma, which also impacts other outcomes. So when we look at the population of children and young people, and we work a lot within the public education and public health systems, if we're not addressing some of these consequences, the causes and consequences of violence, right, including trauma, that impacts the outcomes later in their lives. So the access to educational opportunities, to economic opportunities, those are impacted by how even the neuroscience. I think a lot of us have been learning more recently, more than ever, about mental health and how mental health really hinders your ability to not only, be able to focus and pay attention and really, be present in the moment, but also critical thinking and maintaining relationships. So really, it's not something that's seemingly soft. Like the issue of trauma and mental health is a serious challenge that fortunately now we're talking a lot more about. And when we talk to young people, that is a significant challenge. The other that has not improved at all is just the issues of stigma and marginalization for young people that are living in areas, not just in peri-urban and urban areas that have high rates of violence, of homicide, and of crime, that all of a sudden there's a kind of a blanket assumption that everybody that lives there is involved in some sort of, criminal activity, and without giving any thought to why people do end up involved in criminal activity. So there's, when we think about justice in general, social justice, we really need to think about that as well. Like, what conditions are we creating in our countries? Are we allowing to be perpetuated that do not enable and do not provide for the conditions that people can navigate this adversity, overcome it, and thrive. So we see, the young people we work in particular, there's the heavy stigma that they face really blocks their opportunities and to become the best versions of themselves. I think, gender, you both both you, Father Kranz, and Michael mentioned gender-based violence. Girls and adolescent, young women are disproportionately affected in many ways, as are indigenous populations. So Michael was talking about the Altiplano in Guatemala, but the violence against women and the structures and the legal context is really adverse for women and girls in many cases. So that also really affects not just that girl and that young woman, but it's something that has an intergenerational impact on people's ability and families' ability to access opportunities. And then I kind of, I want to mention just something about forced migration that, we believe in people's right to migrate, but we also believe in people's right to be able to stay home if that's what they want to do. And I think one of the things that we're hearing a lot from young people is just, even if I want to stay, because I do in some cases, they have to leave, they don't. We've had a lot of young people who are threatened, but we really, and I'm as a Salvadoran and a civil society, again, working with government, working with Cooperación like USAID, we really need to change the conditions, because people shouldn't have to leave forcefully, right? And it sounds like a really simple thing to say, but I think sometimes the conversation is more about forced migration at the US border and not really about, wait a second, like, not everybody wants to go. They'd want to stay home. They'd want to stay home with their friends and family. So that's also like your right to be able to do that. And then I'll end with something that, and I also, like Michael said, I also see a lot of opportunity. I see a lot of opportunity with young people here. We work a lot with debate and with leadership. And even the concept of civic leadership doesn't necessarily exist here like it does in other places. And once you do work with, we're working with young people, we're talking to young people, and it's incredible once you have the language and the nuance and the understanding of your potential as a young person to affect change in your community or in your country. It really is transformational. And one of the things that we worked on that I thought was really interesting, we did a study about what skills adolescents felt were most important. And I think we aligned, we looked at the science, we talked to the universities, and we aligned on almost all of them. And one of the social and emotional skills that we didn't include, and the young men and women that we spoke to did, was actually hope. And we hadn't included that like we had included critical thinking, right? Communication. So what I think for me, that's a really loud message that speaks to a lot of these things. Like, we want hope, we want opportunity, we want, and we will take advantage of those if we get them. And thinking about hope is something you can develop, not something you either have or you haven't. So for us, it's just important to keep listening, even in this really difficult context we're facing. Economically, the post-COVID context where learning has just tanked, right? We've had 2 years of, kids don't know how to read and they're in 6th grade. So I think we really need to think about what skills we can focus on in developing young people and developing young leaders, and thinking about the medium and long game as well as the short term. But I do think that the investment in that leadership development is absolutely fundamental, as well as the challenges that Michael mentioned, and poverty, violence, and the structural and systemic overhauls that we need in the region. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for drawing that, I think, really powerful through line from the sort of structural and systemic to the human and the sort of internalized sense of opportunity and hope, or not. That word is so important, right? To have a sense that my life can be different from what I'm seeing today, that I can have opportunities that I'm not maybe observing today. And when we don't feel that, well, then we do feel a need to find some other way. And you trace that out so nicely through the exposure to violence, this sense of mental health and trauma costs of having lived in this sort of environment, and then the stigmatization that comes with that. All of those make your world kind of pretty small, right? They're more and more, they can feel more and more constrained. And so the idea of opening up these resources of hope, and we'll talk about those, especially in our second round, I think is something that really is crucial for us to talk about. So as we're talking, I'm really struck by the way we're hitting on several dimensions of social justice. One of them about the structural factors, the systemic factors, and then one about the very human, I hesitate to call it psychological, but really psyche. It's something about your psyche that feels like it has opportunities or it doesn't. So thank you for highlighting that so very, very well. Now, Yvonne, you've spent a long time serving the region. How do you assess this moment, especially from your perspective as a journalist covering a number of stories and seeing them, again, especially with reference to civil society? How would you assess this present moment? Where do you stand on this?
I want to say thank you, Father Carnes, for inviting me to be part of this panel. I mean, I am extremely grateful to the University of Georgetown. I have to say, to start off, that I agree tremendously with what Celine mentioned. And I also want to say thank you to Michael to be part of it. But I agree with Celine. First of all, I want to start by the fact that I've covered a lot of immigration. It's an issue that has been of a great deal here at Univision. And I've encountered myself with the phenomenon that, in fact, many of the Central American immigrants have told me that had the conditions existed in the region, they would not have left, which is really what catches my attention. And I will share with you a story that I just did yesterday, which was, in fact, a reflection of what I am mentioning. Now, from my standpoint as a journalist, I must say that civil society comes hand in hand with freedom of expression. So to me, what's going on in Central America with my colleagues touches me directly. I find it to be more than appalling. It's really pathetic that being a journalist in Central America means putting your life at risk. In Honduras itself, from 2001 to 2020, 85 journalists were killed in that country. It's simply pathetic and unacceptable, and only 16 perpetrators have been brought to court. Now, every time that we talk about Central America, we talk about the northern countries, what is called the triangle, and there's like very low scores for those nations and things like, for instance, what it's called here, world press freedom. It's El Salvador is located at 67th position out of 180. Guatemala 116, Honduras 151. And now I have to add to that Nicaragua, which is a nation that very seldom is touched upon, but freedom of the press has been heavily affected in Nicaragua with a government that is actually now ruled by a dictator, Daniel Ortega, and has placed Nicaragua in position 121. But going back to Honduras, which is position 151, it's incredible that putting your life at risk as a journalist because you want to inform civil society of what's going on, it entails that you may end up kidnapped or dead. So that, to me, that's been the most appalling part. I've seen that the situation in Guatemala is just as bad when they've created rules that actually civil society cannot create or participate in organizations that allow citizens to have freedom of expression because they are controlled by the government. In fact, Vice President Kamala Harris, in a recent visit to Guatemala in June of 2021, told the president of Guatemala, let civil society organizations do their job without obstacles. I want to say that it is actually uplifting at this point that the United States is seemingly aware of the importance of civil society and that there's also this aspect in which they've agreed that funding for civil society should not be channeled by institutions by the government, like in the case of Guatemala, in which it goes to the Ministry of Interior. So basically, that government chooses who to give the money to. And in addition to that, if it is any non-governmental agencies that will end up criticizing the government, they're either closed, eradicated, or just simply they say, you're not going to get money. Going back to the whole immigration thing, Honduras is going through a period of time in which they just had a presidential election. And I think that right now we have to be, or we should try to be a bit optimistic with Xiomara Castro, in which even though she's the wife of Manuel Zelaya, there is the latent fear that this may turn out to be in another nation like Nicaragua. So I want to think that freedom of the press is actually not going to get worse than it is. And I hope that's going to be the case. But I was really concerned that now our current numbers show that 1 million Hondurans live in the United States, and there's been no attention to the elections in Honduras. in the United States. American media has completely ignored what's going on in that country. Maybe print media has actually pinpointed what's going on, but as far as like broadcasting, I haven't seen anything about it. Yesterday, I had to cover the story of a 15-year-old girl who was lured by a guy in a video game, um, and she ended up leaving South Florida, and they found her in North Carolina. Because this is a cultural problem. Her mother, who is in her early 40s, had her daughter as a teenager. And this girl is now 15. She has no control. She faced the challenge of having to work, leave her only daughter at home. She has to make money to send funds to her family in Central America, where she left 3 of her kids. And basically, when I came across interviewing her, she told me, she says, I don't have a choice. I had to leave fearing violence and persecution. And here I am, and I'm facing another problem. And I feel like I can't get out of this hole in which it gets me nowhere. So the reality is that many of these people don't want to leave. And if things don't really take a change, the migration from Central America will continue. I want to hope that maybe we'll see immediate changes in Honduras, in which probably that doesn't mean that the immigration is going to stop, because probably we're going to see middle and upper class Hondurans leave because of fear that turning into another Nicaragua. But probably maybe poor people will not. Those who seek better opportunities in the United States hopefully will be able to stay. If that happens, then we will see a change. So for now, I want to be hopeful that the United States have actually realized that funds in order to educate the population and make them feel that opportunities can be gathered in their very own homeland depend on sending funds not channeled by institutions linked to the executive government, but actually private citizens, and hopefully that will actually happen.
Thank you very much. And thank you for drawing, again, some really excellent through lines through the idea of freedoms. First of all, freedom of expression, and the particular way that journalists have been threatened in their pursuit of the news and of trying to expose the truth of what's going on. Freedom of civil society to function outside of government control. And then I appreciated your final points too about how sometimes these issues to a United States audience are underappreciated, undercovered by our own press here in the United States, that then allows governments to act with seeming impunity in not allowing these freedoms to exist. So thank you for highlighting those so well. Now, I want to turn our attention a bit. We've seen different dimensions of justice here and the way it might be implemented and carried out. I wonder if we could turn to you one more time and ask you a little bit about those opportunities that you see, or those glimmers of hope, those things that you see happening on the ground, especially through civil society, through citizen action, through the action of journalists and organizations working on the ground. And maybe this time we'll start with Selena, maybe next talk to Yvonne, and then turn to Michael to wrap up that part. And then we'll turn to a few questions. I see people have specific questions about particular countries. And so if you want to weave some of those in, you're welcome to in your answers. But for now, let me turn to Selena and just say, you get to work with lots of organizations that are doing really incredible work, and you pointed to some of that with youth. Could you give us a few more examples like that? Tell us a bit more about where you see opportunities for greater justice in the region.
Sure. I think, unfortunately, I can't see the questions, Father Carnes, so if there's anything specific, but I think, I don't know if I'm doing something wrong.
That's fine. They're Q&A, but don't worry, I'll ask them later.
Oh, okay, perfect. I'll look through the Q&A. Gotcha. Okay. I think, I think that we try to really focus on opportunities, and I think that the region has this, you could call it another, if you compared it to other parts of the world, this luxury of having a huge population of young people, right? That's like the productive generation. We have so many young people that are eager and willing to, either work, those who are of working age, or really learn more and become more educated. So I think for us, when we focus a lot on that, and in our programming, when we work in schools and when we work with so many peer organizations, I think a lot of our focus now is on always asking, first of all, always asking what it is that they feel they need to be able to either stay away from violence or adversity and thrive. And that's really helped us, in some cases innovate, in some cases you're kind of just going back to basics. One of the things we've really done more and more of, and I think a lot of organizations are doing it who work in development, particularly positive youth development and child development, is that when we do ask these questions, a lot of the work is also, it's mobilizing and harnessing and enhancing the agency that young people have. And if they don't feel like, if they don't have or feel that much agency, really working to elevate that and kind of show them what we see, that kind of that potential that you see in them for whatever that may be, for civic engagement, for different kinds of action, just for community service. So I think that that's been something that has been really important for us. And even in the context of mental health, we're working a lot to decentralize access to mental health support, which has been really interesting, because when you provide people with the education and the skills and the tools to be able to manage their own emotions, behavior, reactions, everything, and they understand what they're going through, it's incredible how that really translates in better interactions among people. So I think really when we think about, human-centered is a very popular term in the past few years. And if we really put that into practice, I think that's a really important way to strengthen civil society, to make sure that even though the funders, public and private funders, are investing so much in the region, how do we make sure that becomes that we own, as Salvadoreños, Guatemaltecos, Nicaraguenses, as we really own our own development, and in receiving that support, we also take more leadership and ownership in the process. And I think that's absolutely more necessary than ever. I think right now, I think that's I think that's going to be really important as we move forward in the region, just to take a more active role. And I think to demonstrate to children and young people that they can take a more active role. So I really think that the enhancing that level of agency and also creating spaces for young people is really important. And I also have to say that we've been working in partnership with USAID for a long time, like 12 years or so. And I actually see the shift. Michael was talking about the strategy for the region. There is among USAID, among other funders, there really is I think there's a really marked move towards like a very specific and clear move towards strengthening. And this is in the past few years, not just right now, but I really see that investment in strengthening local organizations and civil society. And it's really exciting, because I think that way we will be able to create more generations of leaders and have more local leadership in the communities where we're working at the grassroots level. So I think that kind of the inclusion piece is becoming more and more evident in what we're seeing in our direct work with young people and also with other organizations that work across the region. We're seeing more people, on the one hand, more people wanting to be engaged. Obviously, there are contextual, geopolitical, and just political contexts that are right now making it more difficult. But we do see in young people that desire to be involved. And it's just about equipping young people with the critical thinking skills, the communication skills, the agency, and the hope, and providing those spaces and opportunity for them to be able to really come forward and drive their own development and that of their communities.
Yeah, I love the idea there. I mean, a few keywords: human-centered, agency, and local. And what a mindset change that is, right? I mean, it's I think sometimes when we're immersed in it, we don't see what a massive shift this is, right? So instead of just thinking about sort of some of the measurable outcomes in terms of, number of years in school or something, but actually thinking about how does that then care for the whole person that allows them to feel activated? How does then do they feel an opportunity to exercise their own agency? And especially when we think about restructuring, the idea that the main ideas would be local. I mean, how very, very important. So thank you for highlighting those trends in the region these days. Yvonne, what do you see as opportunities at this moment as we look at the region and it grapples with some of the issues you described? What are the opportunities on the ground for improvement and expression there?
Father Carnes, I have to say that sometimes I find it difficult to see opportunities, because I hear, for instance, Selena and her area of work is in Central America. My area of work, I see them more here. I see more of my people coming to the United States. And when you guys address the issue of like, yes, our nations have this potential of a lot of young people, a population of young people. I see that young people coming to the United States, and I see them become blue workers, blue collar workers. And it saddened me to see that because of the lack of education, and it's become a cultural thing that I have seen happening. It's a cycle that it's been difficult to break, because what happens is sometimes even the mothers push the children to leave, fearing the violence. I mean, but the reality is that they're not prepared to go into other countries. If I were to see opportunities, I mean, I don't want to see my field die. I don't want to see journalists disappear in Central America. When, for instance, I see that in El Salvador, there's a special legislative commission, what once existed to investigate harassment. And it had a report in November 2020, and the president of El Salvador basically said that we are going to get rid of this commission. So that commission does not exist. Where does it leave the journalists? Sometimes I find it difficult to see these opportunities, and perhaps it has to do that because of the standpoint of where I see everything. I see the people leaving the region, coming here, running away from it. So sometimes it leads me to believe it's like, what is really the solution? I have to believe that education will definitely be the best way to do it. And how do we convince them to stay? How do we lead them to believe that they're going to be better off staying, boys and girls? I want to be hopeful that the United States now with this new administration will actually see a different aspect of it, but it all depends on funding. We know that it has to do with money. It has to do with the fact that they create those opportunities there, but we have to make sure that they're not channeled by the governments themselves, because otherwise I think, like I said, Selena sees things from there, from Central America. That's where she sees it. And I don't doubt that she must see the leadership and she must see the capability of some of those people eager to move forward and go ahead and move ahead. From my standpoint, I see them coming. I see them running away. I see them in fear and coming here to face other dangers in which at many times they feel like they have no control of it. So that's got to be what I see so far.
Thank you. No, that's well, to think of the challenges that push people to leave, and the fear that can drive that. And then also the crucial role of funding. You know, all of the things we're talking about actually do depend at the end of the day on having sufficient funding, sufficient resources, especially money, but then also in the lives of real people, time, security, these sorts of things that allow you to actually spend the time studying or working, starting a business, all these sorts of things. So that's really helpful. Let's turn then to Michael, who works with an agency that actually has some funds. So it's interesting to think about how those funds get deployed. And it's also interesting to think about the larger role of the US in the region. And one question did come in about that, so, you know, the United States has many influences in the region. One of those are the larger efforts of the United States in terms of its trade policy, what some would label sort of neoliberal agendas in the region. So how do you see those in concert with the efforts of USAID to build from the ground up? You know, are we working at cross purposes sometimes with the US involvement in the region? How do you see it, Michael, and what hope and opportunity is there?
Sure, thanks. And those are good and tough questions. I maybe just preface by saying, you know, one of the reasons I'm happy we have a whole of government strategy, this root causes strategy that I mentioned that we spent the first 6 months of the administration building together is just, you know, for this reason, because we are able to bring, you know, the full capacity of the U.S. government to bear, and not just USAID's development programming. And in many cases, that's what it's going to take, is bringing, you know, the tools of USAID and the State Department and Treasury and the DFC, Department of Justice in some cases, USTR certainly, to bear on particularly kind of tricky challenges. DHS even has a role to play in the region, as well as certainly here at home. So, but let me speak, if I could, Father, to the opportunities piece of this, because there are some things that give me hope. The first is, and I think it's probably true for any of us who've spent time in the region, it's the people we meet, the people we've worked with. I started my career working with grassroots organizations in Guatemala, human rights defenders who are on the front lines of many of the challenges that we're still working at today. And you just, especially dealing with young people in the region, there's tremendous human capital, tremendous energy, tremendous kind of commitment to making better societies and better communities. And we just need to find the way to sort of tap into that. I think Selena spoke to that particularly powerfully. The second thing that gives me hope is frankly the unique opportunity, I would say, that we have in Washington. We have a president who knows this region extremely well, who dealt with this file personally when he was vice president, who, going back to the campaign, was talking about a $4 billion commitment in Northern Central America. So certainly we have leadership at the very top in the administration. But I would say, even, and this gets a little bit to the funding question, when we have conversations with our colleagues on Capitol Hill, you don't get a lot of pushback on the idea that the United States needs to be present, the United States needs to be invested in this region, that we have a direct stake in helping Salvadorans, Guatemalans, and Hondurans find a prosperous, dignified, hopeful future at home. You're going to find differences of approach. There's going to be questions about tactics. There's going to be programs that some people like more than others. But in terms of the basic premise that the United States has a strong stake in trying to improve conditions in Central America, you don't get a ton of pushback. And I think that's, in a Washington that doesn't tend to agree on a whole lot of things, that's to be celebrated, and hopefully puts us in good stead to get the kind of resources we need to make the kinds of investments that we believe we need. And then the final thing that kind of brings these things together is, I think we have some real opportunities to build partnerships between the United States and the region on a lot of different fronts. Certainly with governments, although that has been challenging. We have a new government coming in Honduras that presents us with a new opportunity to start a conversation there. I think the challenges that we've faced on the governance side in El Salvador and Guatemala, and Honduras for that matter, are no secret probably to anybody who's listening on this call. We'll continue to be very frank about those challenges and what our expectations are. But where we see opportunities with national governments or sub-national governments or elements of governments to partner, we will. Although I think Yvonne's point is well taken. USAID does not, generally speaking, provide direct budget support for governments, national governments in the region. I think it's less than 2% of the funding we provide. Everything we do, for the most part, is through either third-party implementers or civil society or international organizations. So I'll say a little bit more about that in a second. But certainly we need to be judicious and selective about the government partners we seek. I think we've got a real opportunity with the private sector, and the vice president has been leading a lot of this work through her call to action and something called the Partnership for Central America, where we have, a number of multinational corporations and other entities that are committed to making, big new investments in the region, providing jobs and opportunities, especially for young people in Northern Central America. And so I think you will see that those partnerships expand over time. Obviously, we need to do some things on the business and labeling environment front to make those investments prosper and to make other private sector entities, willing to come in with their own capital. But I think there is what we're finding is that many kind of mission-driven and profit-driven entities in the private sector are willing to take a fresh look at this region and work with us to provide new opportunities. And then, civil society really is, I think, for us, kind of a bulwark. It's where a lot of the expertise, the heart, the resilience resides in Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador, and we have some tremendous partners like Selena's organization that are doing heroes work on the ground. And so The challenge here, as Yvonne referenced, is that precisely at the moment where we're looking to civil society to carry more of the load, the civic space that exists for those organizations to operate is being constricted. And you could put independent media, I think, in the same bucket, and I think Yvonne spoke to that quite powerfully as well. So we need to do some things on the diplomatic side, and even with some of our more kind of tough tools to defend as forcefully as possible the space for those kinds of organizations to do the crucial work that they're doing. And the last thing I just want to say on this, and Selena referenced it, is our commitment at USAID to work more deliberately with local organizations in this region. We, as I mentioned, we don't tend to do direct budget support for government, but we do work probably too heavily with international implementers, whether that's the kind of big implementers in Washington or multilateral organizations, many of which do really excellent work. But we have been too skewed in that direction and not sufficiently focused on building capacity and partnerships with organizations in the region that know their communities the best. And so just last month, Administrator Power gave a major address at Georgetown, in which she kind of laid out her vision on the 60th anniversary of USAID's founding. And one of the things she announced in that speech was an initiative called Centroamérica Local. And under this initiative, within the root causes strategy, we are making a $300 million commitment to expanding our partnerships with local organizations. We think that will make us more responsive, more inclusive, more sustainable, ultimately more effective in delivering the development outcomes that we seek in the region. And so I want to thank Selena for the plug there, for recognizing that effort. It's not easy for all sorts of bureaucratic reasons that I won't bore you with, but certainly something that we're committed to in terms of how we work, as well as kind of what the pillars of our efforts are around this root causes strategy. So I'll leave it there, Father. I know we have very little time and some very good questions, so I'll turn it back to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for that really complete answer. I'm going to jump right to the questions, and we'll have to be something of a lightning round, or maybe just each of you can respond, maybe just one time briefly. And I'm going to start with the question about, does it really help us to think about these countries as a unit? We're talking about Central America as if there was something that, linked them other than their geography. And for anyone who's visited any of the countries of Central America, they are radically different, different in culture, in history, in current governments, in natural resources, in economic strengths. There are just so many differences. So is it helpful to think of these together, or should we really think about them differently? And if we do, how should we think about some of the new governments that have come to power? So we had a consistent set of questions about, what do you think about, Bukele in El Salvador? What do you think about the prospects in Honduras? What do you think about Nicaragua right now and the opportunities for the right? So rather than feel like you have to touch on all of those, maybe the more fundamental question is, should we think of it as a region? And if we shouldn't, is there something you want to point to, in one case that we should be taking maybe particularly seriously or focusing on? But if we were each to take like 1 minute or maybe 2 at most, that would be kind of best. And let's start with Selena, since you actually went from being a single country organization to one that looks across the region.
Look, I answered that in the Q&A also a little bit. I do think there's value to talking about regional because there are like transnational phenomena. There are definitely nuances in each country. And I would even say sub-regions, right? I would talk about even at the community level. So I think that I don't think they're not mutually exclusive. And I do think we need to pay attention to the unique context locally. And as far as the governments are concerned, I think we need to remember that they were elected by the majority of the population. So I think right now, I think when we think about social justice, we need to think about how do people end up elected? What is it that people are feeling? What are they needing as the population? And that brings us back to social justice, right? Like, what are we doing well and what are we not doing well to really make these countries all of our countries provide opportunities for everybody, not just for a few people. So.
Thank you. That was remarkably concise. Thank you. Very well done. Let's turn to Yvonne next.
I would like to think that we could be a region. I think we would have more power, we would have a greater voice, but maybe that's a bit of a romantic dream that I have. As a Central American myself, even though I left Central America over 30 years ago. I do believe that would be greater. However, the nature of each of the governments and of these nations actually forbid that from happening. As far as governments being democratically elected, perhaps that may be something that may be happening now in Honduras, even though they said that they have not stopped doing the count, but it was a great people of voters that went out and elected Xiomara Castro. And although I am still not quite convinced about what her goals are, I have to remain optimistic that things will get better. In the case of Nicaragua, to me, that's a prime example how things would be completely different. The Organization of American States, 25 of those nations said that they do not recognize the presidential elections held on November 7th. And because of that reason, Daniel Ortega is deciding to pull out of the Organization of American States. And that's a prime example of a dictatorship, of someone who do not believe in democratic values and who actually does not care about the population or the press. All the media, all the independent media has practically left. They are functioning through platforms, and many of them are overseas in other countries, whether it's Costa Rica, Honduras, and some of them even from the United States. As far as like one of the things that I want to address, Central America is important for the United States, the northern nations of Central America, because of the immigration, because of that problem and that obstacle that has been caused to any of the governments, whether it was the Trump administration and now Biden. This is the reason why we're putting attention to it. Nicaragua was a nation that was never included on that. Now, however, according to Homeland Security, comparing figures of 2019 to 2020, less than 1,000 Nicaraguans were caught in the border crossing from Mexico to the United States. The year after, 38,000. That just goes to show you that Nicaragua is probably going to be added to this whole aspect of the problem that Central America represents. And since Michael has addressed very well the intentions of the administration to pay more attention to what's going on in the region and how President Biden is fully aware and knowledgeable about that whole thing, I hope that also President Biden will do something and pay attention to what's going on in Nicaragua so that that country does not become another problem of migration, which the reality of it is that in this case, it's a political thing more than economic, which is the common denominator of Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador added to violence. But in the case of Nicaragua, is political aspect with violence caused by a dictatorship.
Thank you for highlighting that. And I do agree. This is where we're seeing the region drift into a very dangerous territory and territory that leaves what we would call democracy. And that is extremely concerning. Michael, let me turn to you for maybe one final word, very brief, just to sort of, if there's anything you'd like to say on this emphasis, maybe, as you think about the administration's plan, how you're thinking both of region and, individual countries that are so distinct.
Yeah, it's a great question. I won't do it justice in a minute, but just to say, I think we're trying to do both. The root causes strategy is regional. We also at USAID have country development strategies for each of the countries that are updated regularly and much more kind of granular. But we also have a regional Central America mission and strategy. So because there are, as Selena mentioned, there are challenges that lend themselves to regional solutions. So something like trade facilitation might be one of those things. So I think we need to think about the common challenges, certainly any solutions that cut across borders and require a regional response. But ultimately, from a development perspective, from a diplomatic perspective, we do need to take each country on its own merits and deal with the governments in each of those places. And even within countries, I mean, I mentioned Huehuetenango at the start. I mean, Huehuetenango's development indicators versus those of Guatemala more broadly are pretty striking. So there's some of those nuances even within sometimes rural urban in place like Guatemala or Honduras, less so in El Salvador. So again, a short and inadequate answer to a very good question, but hopefully gives you a sense of how we think about this.
No, thank you very much. And thank you all. Thank you, Selena. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Yvonne, for being with us today. for this conversation. It's an important moment, and all of the work that you're doing, each from your own perspectives, makes a tremendous difference in the region. And we're proud to be able to partner with it here at Georgetown and have this conversation. We look forward to continuing the conversation. We've actually had this, as I mentioned, as a series of 3 conversations. The next will look at economic opportunity and especially private sector current possibilities and opportunities in the region, as we keep thinking about how can we give a focus to this region that is so important to the United States and to the world. So thank you again for accompanying us. Thank you to our listeners who have been with us today. We look forward to continuing the conversation. Have a very good night, and thank you all again.